Okay, we might get started. Thank you to everybody. I think we've got, what are we up to? 83 participants, so that's fantastic. Welcome to everybody this afternoon to the Australian Circular Economy Hub's evidence-based decision-making webinar with one of our technical supporters, Edge Environment. But before we get started, I did want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, as well as the lands on which all of you are joining us, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So the ACE Hub is funded by the Australian Government and our foundation sponsors Bingo Industries, Keep Cup and Planet Ark Power. Our mission is to facilitate the transition to a circular economy in Australia by providing a platform for knowledge sharing and collaboration. And so our webinar series is very much about that knowledge sharing. Our presenter today is Dr. Matthew Parnell, Head of Circular Economy and Life Cycle Thinking at specialist sustainability advisory company Edge Environment. Matthew has over 40 years of professional sustainability experience and leads a team of consultants working in everything from life cycle assessment, strategy and auditing, and circular economy policy, just to name a few, and certainly Matthew will give us some more information on that when he presents shortly. So this introductory webinar is the first in a series that will dive deeper into metrics for business, government, and for community. So hopefully you'll be able to take some snapshots from Matthew's vast experience on this topic. But before we get into the event, I just wanted to have a bit of housekeeping. So this event is being recorded and we will share the recording next week. We invite you to use the chat to connect with people who might also be on the call, but also if you've got specific questions that you'd like to have as discussion points at the end of the event, please put those in the Q&A box. We'll get to probably have around 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to go through those questions. You'll also notice in the Q&A box that we have an upvote option where you can click on the questions that you think are, really quite critical that we could tackle first on the list. So really, have a go at participating in that. So with that brief introduction, I'll pass over to Matthew, who will take us through his presentation. And Matthew, I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your experience today. So thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. And hello, everyone. And a particular shout out to those of you in Sydney that are suffering under lockdown. Hopefully I'll bring a little bit of cheer and distraction to you today. Anyway, the topic is evidence-based decision-making for circular economy, harness the power of data. And this is a very big brief, and I'm going to try to attack it in a number of different ways. But firstly, I would like to do my own acknowledgement of country. This is one that approach I use quite a bit to acknowledgement, which is a little bit different from the usual, but I just want to say I respectfully acknowledge the Yalukit Willam clan on Boonwurrung country in the Kulin Nation where I live. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. I also acknowledge all the First Nations elders and traditional owners across Australia where I was born, educated, lived, worked, married, and where my children were born. The backdrop that I have in this talk is from a painting from an Indigenous artist that I worked with in Central Australia, more than 20 years ago. And it's a rock hole story and about the importance of caring for country as a core part of life. So I just want to also finalise that by saying I've lived on First Nations country all my life, and I acknowledge that country owns me, and therefore I have a deep responsibility to care for country. My work as a professional sustainability practitioner is my expression of that responsibility. Nicole gave me a great introduction, so I won't necessarily go through all this, but I'm part of Edge Environment, and Edge is a really exciting place doing really interesting things. And the mantra of science, strategy and storytelling is the approach to sustainability that's there. And I'm going to be cutting across all of that in today's presentation. I also want to acknowledge that I've got a great team to work with at Edge in life cycle assessment, resource recovery, waste management, strategy and auditing, product stewardship, and circular economy policy, strategy, facilitation, activation, and analytics. I just want to note and a shout out to Swinburne University, where I used to be working. I'm an adjunct research fellow in the Centre for Urban Transitions at Swinburne University as well. But to the purpose of today's webinar is to present an overview of the role of data and evidence in the transition to a circular economy. And I'm going to assume that most of you listening are familiar with circular economy principles. So I'm not going to start off with butterfly diagrams and so on. I'm going to assume you know that. But on the other side, if you're a really big data nerd, this webinar is not going to review specific measurement platforms or tools, and it's based on insights from my experience rather than catch-all of stuff that's already out there that you can access. So hopefully those insights will add to what you already know, and hopefully sort of clarify some things for you. So we're going to go through a range of things, looking at what evidence is, looking at some fundamental questions, the cost of evidence, some foundation tools, particularly the context of evidence and the data types we look at, but focusing on how to plan for evidence and situating decision-making in evidence-based and the pros and cons of that. What to do if you don't have data, and what to do if you do have data and it tells you your business model is not sustainable. How do you respond to that? And also the way I've set up this presentation, I've used mostly images from things I've been involved in or our team has been involved in, and they all have a little story connecting to the things being talked about. So one of the activities I've been involved for the last few years before coming to Edge has been working with a group of stakeholders in the city of Medellin in Colombia on stakeholder engagement towards circular economy transitions. And so I use this image of a place where a community cooperative that does recycle, collecting and sorting, and a private company, Separaplast, have joined up to achieve great things in their local part of Medellin. And I find that quite inspirational as to showing how the ways forward for circular economy are going to cut across channels. It involves a lot of connection. So the data nerds are going to get something here. So if you're interested, this presentation is equivalent in size to 5.0034 football fields and 2.654 Olympic pools. The presenter, me, weighs the equivalent of 0.01 rhinoceroses and 25,000 PET bottles. The room from which this presentation is delivered has the volume of 11 black balloons, and the data in this presentation has been accredited by the Pons Institute. All of the proceeds from this webinar support the Circularity Theatre Company in Agadagada, and no bin chickens were harmed in the making of this presentation. Now, of course, the bin chicken bit is true, but it's completely irrelevant. Agadagada is actually a real place, and everything else is dodgy. So this is a little parable of how, yeah, you can pull a whole lot of data together and you can be completely meaningless in the way you use it. So it's not just data and evidence, it's how you use it. So hold that in your heads as we go through the rest. So what is evidence? Evidence it gets a lot of traction, and we hear evidence-based this, evidence-based policy, evidence-based practice, and that's great. It raises the bar for suggesting there's always a point where evidence, above which evidence is needed and below which it's not evidence, so therefore we don't do anything. I think we need to introduce into this evidence discussion the concept of different ways of knowing, and this is where the quantitative meets the qualitative. This is where, the data we have ties in with observation and storytelling. And also the other aspect about it is that we need to understand with evidence what rigor do we need at the level of work that we're doing to be able to say there is evidence for what we're doing and evidence for which we're basing our decisions on. So I think the focus should be on a form of data and a level of rigor to drive change in a practical rather than academic way. If you're looking at academic evidence, that's a completely different standard of rigor than the kinds of evidence we need in everyday practice and in communicating our achievements. So it's really critical that we have that in mind when we decide what are we going to measure. So, I'm not going to say that quantitative evidence is not an essential part. It is. And there's a lot that we need to do in terms of evidence to grow a circular economy. But just remember, when you're sort of looking for that fact, that data and evidence is fundamentally socio-technical. It sits within social systems and cultures. And those are the systems and cultures that actually collect and process data and draw meaning from data. Social systems decide what data to look for. So this gets down to the role of humans in this. Even if all the data is coming from automatic digital means, that meaning making is a human task. And that means data of any type must be embedded in a compelling story to enable change. Just putting up numbers is not enough. It has to have a way of connecting with people. I've got an image there of some work I did with students on analog methods of data collecting and sorting. And sometimes that's all you've got in your toolkit. And I'll talk more about that later. So there's just a few fundamental questions to hold in mind. Do you know what the data means when you get it? If you measure it, are you going to manage it? And that's flipping that story of if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Well, I disagree with that fundamentally, because so much of the time we do a lot of measurement and we don't manage it. It doesn't lead to anything. The other thing is, does good evidence prevent bad decisions? No. We've got heaps of evidence about climate change, but we've been slow to address it. So the evidence hasn't been the story. It's been the human story around the meaning making of evidence that's been partly responsible. What do you do when you're faced with competing facts? Because facts don't exist in a vacuum. And a fact about something might depend on context. It might need to be related to differently in a different context. So we often have problems in trying to work out whether the facts we've got are appropriate for what we're doing. But most important and most critically is that, does an evidence-based approach lead to change? If it's not leading to change or stopping change, what's the point? In my experience, I've often seen the question of data and evidence interpreted to prevent necessary action. I'm pretty sick of hearing, what's your business case for doing this? Because I've been in positions where I've built business cases to make change and people just ignore it. And so clearly the business case argument was just an excuse not to do anything. And so when the business case is actually made, sometimes those people just shut up and don't do anything and hope no one notices. So that the other thing is that sometimes you build the data for a case and it has a problem with people's perceptions or worldview. And in fact, people then double down their resistance to the data there. So just having data is not enough to drive the change that we want to have happening. So the other thing to remember is that, okay, if we go ahead and collecting evidence in some way, there's a cost involved. There's a cost in people's time, in subscriptions to platforms, software, and the time invested in finding out the things you need to find out in order to make the decisions you need to make. So you need to look at what kind of evidence you need, what you need it for, how will you get it, can you afford to pay for it? What will you do with it when you have it? What if you don't have it? What can or can't you claim based on the evidence? So if you are planning to make really big claims about what you're doing in your organisation or whatever, that's going to raise the bar on the evidence you'll need. But what if you don't have the dollars for it? We often get small startups come to us and would like carbon footprinting and life cycle assessment. And when you actually quote how much this is going to cost, they don't have the money for it. So does that mean, oh, sorry, you can't enter the circular economy because you can't afford to pay for the LCA? No, but there's other things you can do to get going on the journey and not use that as an excuse to do nothing. So it's really important to understand what do you really need to do? Can you afford it? Or what can you afford to, and what can you actually do within what you can afford? So these are really critical questions for setting up. So this then leads into what are the foundation tools for evidence in circular economy? And so fundamentally, the Sustainable Development Goals are creating that overarching framework for practice and evidence base. So important to get across those. But usually one of the first things you do is baseline, whatever it is your footprint is in whatever it is that you do. So you can then track change from there. And then you might also benchmark to see what other people that you compare yourselves to, what other organisations or businesses or industries. So you benchmark. Inevitably, waste's involved in the story, and a lot of people in the circular economy see focusing on waste as conceptually wrong, but that's often the key into the process. So waste audits and tracking, that is foundational stuff. Sometimes if you can't really get the data yourself, sometimes going to eco-labelling and product directories can give you a start. So that can be foundational work about the materials and components and assemblies that you might be using. Life cycle assessment can be done to different degrees, and that often includes a hotspot analysis to find out where the areas are that you need to work on, so you can practice or improvements and so forth. And we've got a picture of a generic edge life cycle assessment process shown there in that diagram. Environmental product declarations are another sort of foundation tool that you can access. Materials flow analysis, input, output, what's flowing in, what's flowing out in terms of goods and services and waste and stuff that can be recycled back into systems. Carbon footprinting, which I've mentioned as a key baseline. And then there's a whole suite of things under circular metrics, and I'm not going into detail on circular metrics because that's going to be covered in later seminars. But just interesting new news, there's an update on ISO 59020 that's going to have a whole lot of guidance on circular metrics, which will be worthwhile checking out when that lands possibly later this year or early next year. I'm not 100% sure. So the context for evidence is massively important in any decision making about what kind of evidence you're going to track. So you have to think in terms of scales and systems in terms of context. So in this diagram, we look, at the materials and components, products, services, up through businesses, consumers, civil society, towns, cities and regions, governments, international agencies, NGOs operating internationally. But never forget that this all sits in ecological systems. A lot of the circular economy models that kick around, it's easy to see that they're forgetting that the whole point of this is for protecting, restoring, regenerating natural systems. So if you don't have that in your context, you're actually missing some very key stuff about circularity. So the important thing is that to understand that we're talking about a circular economy here, not a circular business model or whatever. To get to a circular economy, we've got to work all those scales. We can't just work one scale at the expense of others. We have to integrate them across all the different scales. And so we have to activate those to facilitate the growth of a circular economy. And no scale is independent of the others. There's connections throughout all of that. So it's important to understand what scale are you operating at and what connections to other scales are part of your journey to circular economy. And then within those different contexts of your operation, what do you need to communicate within your context and beyond your context to be able to sort of make sound, proper claims about what you're doing, particularly if you're doing marketing around that. Hugely important to really understand how those all intersect. Then the other context is your business model. There's lots of different business models, and I'm not going to go into detail on what these business models are, but from the resource extraction through to eco-efficiency in manufacturing, and then different product stewardship approaches, sustainable product service systems, lease-based models, industrial ecology, where co-location of factories enable waste from one factory to become a resource for another one. And then the way we're looking at cities and regions and looking at that network-based approach to circular economy there. These are all different business models, and they all have different requirements for measurements. And if you just take what you think is supposed to be what you do in circular analytics and apply it to the wrong business model, you might get the wrong data. I've got just an image there of just to show a business model for the design of a furniture recovery ecosystem that we're currently working on at Edge with the Global Product Stewardship Council and GECA under a federal government grant. So there's lots of stuff happening, but the metrics are going to be different for whatever model you're going to go to. But having said that, there are some fundamental types of data that we look at. So I've classified this broadly into environmental data and circular data, because a lot of what's happening out in terms of waste management, waste auditing, trying to sort of go to zero waste and all that, we need to just know what are we generating, what's going to landfill, what's being diverted, what's recyclable, what's not, what's being transformed into something else, what are the carbon emissions, and so on. Most of you would be familiar with most of those measurements of data, and that's all good data. And that's probably going to be, broadly, a lot of that stuff is going to be somewhere in your circular analytics at some stage, and probably at the earlier stages. But going to circularity and trying to map your progress on circularity it's a different degree of difficulty. So this is where we're sort of really trying to move beyond just diversion from landfill. We're trying to maintain value of material in the system, reusing materials. So part of the furniture product stewardship, for example, is how can that furniture be reused as furniture when it's no longer required in one site, rather than going to landfill or just being sort of chopped up into pieces and maybe the metal recovered or something like that. So there's a whole range of circular data there. Is it being transformed to new resource? Is it being reused at a higher grade or a lower grade? What's the level of renewable energy and water that's going into the production? What are the material flows? Have you got enough 100% recycled material to put in your process? Can you get it all the time? Or you're going to have a business model that might have fluctuating levels of recycled content. The other thing is, what are the flow-on impacts? Some of the circular data probably doesn't really go into this, but at some stage, everything that we do has a second, a third, and fourth order impact, and so on. And we need to start mapping that kind of thing as it goes out into the system. So that's going to be sort of a stretch for a while. And then there's just the data that if we're going to sort of move material as waste, as converting it to resource for somewhere else, knowing the flows of that material is going to be important. So there's going to be all sorts of new demands for the kinds of data that we need to do into the future. Now, I need to keep moving. I'm sort of conscious I'm sort of talking a bit too much on some of these points, but the next key point is really understanding about planning for evidence. And wherever you are in the path to circular economy, there's always something you can do. But whatever you do now, you should match up with a plan for doing something as you grow into the circular economy. So this is why we sort of use the circular roadmap process, which involves mapping the visions, mapping the processes, the phases you're going through, the baseline data you need, and planning for the circular data, even if you're not really there to begin with. So you're really going to focus critically on input-output factors, materials in, carbon, energy, water, waste out. You're going to be considering LCA. If you can't pay for it now, you might think maybe next year we can start an LCA process and so on. Then there's other things about LCA that it could be on a process, not a product, or a building or infrastructure or organizations. And so you might start off just with one product, then go to more products, then maybe do it for the process. Maybe you might decide to do the buildings that you're in, or building new buildings for your manufacturing, to do a building LCA. Maybe do one for the whole organization. So there's all those things that can be taken into account. But whatever stage you are in your planning, wherever you get to do, the key thing is whatever you know through whatever data methods you're using at any point in time, respond appropriately. And that might mean you've got to redesign stuff or apply eco design principles to reduce material quantity, design for disassembly, remanufacture, and impact. So for each round of transformation, you should be increasing your rigor, be more circular, account for connection, scaling up and scaling out, tracking the next order impacts. You can't do it all at once necessarily, but you can plan to build up to that. So when it comes to the decision-making, it means you've got to follow through on the data, good or bad. If the data's bad, the data's bad, so you make changes in response. So, if your motivation is just to get good data so you can put that to the public, and you get bad data, what are you going to do? Are you going to sort of get cranky and walk away, or are you going to deal with the real issues? So this is where the data you have is the data you have, and you have to be transparent about it, especially if you want to put it out there in a public domain. So don't make unsupported claims or, getting into greenwashing. It's better to make claims about a journey to circularity with demonstrated progress than big unsupported claims. So if you get data conflicting with your vision for your business, then you have to make some on-balance holistic decisions. So you might have more carbon emissions than you'd like. You might use more water than you'd like, but you can plan to make those changes, because if you make those changes, you can improve your data over time. It's the people that don't know much about it, but expect people like us to just kick the tires and say, it's all fantastic. You are as green can be. Well done. That doesn't always happen, right? So, and to get to a point where you've got, like in this extract from a Vinadex polypropylene pipes, a publicly declared EPD, you've gone through a lot of rigor and process to get to that point. And it might have taken a long time to get to that point. So keep that in mind. You might not be up for an EPD just yet. What happens if you don't have the data? Well, then, if it's sketchy, you've got to start where you are. You've got to take early and proactive action, even if you don't have the data. Be precautionary about it. You can always make decisions on an experimental basis, form some hypotheses, scenarios, test them out, pivot on the feedback, amplify the good and dampen the bad. You can always start your journey if you've got components and materials that you can access from EPD registers or from Good Environmental Choice Australia and other eco-labelling schemes. Then you can say, we're using these things in our material. We're not life cycling yet, but we know that we're using good material sources for what we're doing. That's a way to get into it. What if the data shows your business model is not sustainable, like the possibly defunct secondhand goods facility or art installation at Fish Creek in Victoria? A real place on the main road through Fish Creek. Couldn't tell whether it was a shop or used to be a shop or a failed business or what, but there it is. But a key point is that if you work on the basis there are lots of environmental problems out there, and you've identified one, and you've built a business and a business model about solving that environmental problem, it doesn't mean that it's a sustainable position that you've got until you start building up data. And this is where some early stage companies often make big claims about what they're doing because they see a big problem and this is their response. So obviously it's going to be sustainable, but it doesn't always work like that when the data starts coming in. And what can happen is that, that looks like sort of, maybe in a way to get around, they're shifting an environmental problem somewhere else, or their product, yes, it's dealing with a problem, but it's less durable, so it doesn't last as long. It performs poorly and it's discarded, So it might be made from a natural fibre, but it doesn't last long and it's still put in the Vinnie's box or worse, in the trash. You might be a situation where the product you're using or materials you're using are part of a product stewardship scheme, but you live somewhere where you can't access that scheme. And so therefore it's not happening. You might not get traction in the marketplace, so you start saying things that you shouldn't be saying. And that's not good for a sustainable circular economy business. And you may find that your model sounds good, but it's not, financially sustainable in the outset, and you have to make more plans and more changes and so forth. So, the key thing is stop making claims you can't support, go with the data that you've got, redesign your business model to reduce or eliminate problems and hotspots, redesign your products and processes, design out waste, carbon emissions and reduce impacts, redesign products and processes to facilitate resale, reuse, disassembly and remanufacture, but keep reviewing, replanning, remeasuring. Hopefully you will get there, stay in business and get there, and you'll get to having a sustainable business model. But maybe you can't demonstrate that early on. You don't want to be like the Choluteca Bridge in Honduras, the right thing in the wrong place. So to summarize, measure and map what matters, know what you are measuring and mapping, know when to use it, ensure it's circular, plan for circularity at the outset, make it actionable to support and lead change. That's what we really want to do. And apply evidence to activate connection and collaboration for shared responsibility across businesses, across industries, across regions, and so on, cities, towns, regions. And always remember, your evidence must lead to a sustainable circular economy within the environmental limits. There's big questions as to whether what you're doing, whether you should be dematerializing something. I don't know. But the environmental limits are very real and they're coming closer and closer and closer. So just the final thoughts is that evidence does not always lead to action. So you've got to make sure that you get the maximum impact for transformation towards a circular economy from your evidence collecting efforts. And on that note, I'll come to an end and I'll stop the screen share. Where are we?
Mute.
Nicole?
Thank you. Yes, I'm still here. Sorry, I had too many things open on the bottom there. I couldn't find my unmute button. Matthew, that was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, just a snapshot, literally, of all of your vast experience.
Right. I hope people were out there listening.
I'm sure they were. I'm sure they were. But, it's really important to understand what measurement means. I mean, some of those definitions and then its importance to decision-making, that we don't just do these measures just for the sake of doing them, that we actually feed into something that's much more, a much wider plan, as you were saying. So I've got a few questions of my own, but I thought we might just see who's got some points in the Q&A. We've got one question here from Lisa Ehrenfried. I hope I've got that right, Lisa. Apologies if I've just said that completely wrong. Are there any guidelines on carbon footprinting that you would recommend, Matthew?
Guidelines on carbon footprinting?
Yeah.
Again, it depends on where you are. Let's say it's absolute entry level and you don't have a cent to spend. There are lots of free tools out there. There's a plethora of apps, where from the household to other things where you can. Sorry, I thought I had my phone turned off. There's a huge amount of apps and online things you can access for entry-level stuff on carbon footprinting. Obviously, there's a point when you're getting serious about it. You need to get some serious calculations done, and it's often not so simple, and it needs a bit of research. So you need to work with people that know what they're talking about. And there's, I mean, obviously consultants like us can do it, but you know, there are tools that people can access if they want to start that journey themselves.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Circularity tool? Is that a useful tool to start with, if being that it's a free, one of those free ones?
Yeah, I can understand the question, because sometimes the free stuff has got so many problems with it, it's almost useless. But
okay.
This is one of the reasons why I've sort of assumed you've got some knowledge, because that's Ellen MacArthur Foundation's usually the first port of call, and their stuff's unbelievably good, and their tools definitely worthwhile looking at. All their advice and trainings and so forth, strongly recommend for anyone. So that would be a good place to start.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Matthew. We've got a question here from Ginger Yay. What sort of stories would you tell to communicate effectively from the evidence?
Well, yeah. Depends on who I'm talking to.
Yeah, right.
If I'm talking to a bunch of crusty production engineers in the shop floor, I might talk a different way than talking to a consumer group, or talking to people in government, or talking to a bunch of climate skeptics. And that the thing is, there's no one way. It's about trying to find some common ground, first and foremost, finding out what their fears, particularly, because often these discussions about change for sustainability, let alone circular economy and climate change, they get bogged down in what people fear, and I think that's behind a lot of stuff. So if you can really get a feel for what people's fears are, what they feel they might lose by the change, because people tend to make the sense of what they're losing much bigger than the benefit, particularly if the benefit's a couple of years down the track compared to now. That's what we did in the workshops in Colombia that we ran, where we had everyone from street collectors and community cooperatives to multinational corporations in the room. Fantastic. Was that we spent a fair bit of time on drawing out what people's values were, what their loyalties were, what they feared most, and what they thought they might lose, to then go beyond that to have it. So that's probably always a good way to then work out what the story you're trying to communicate through the data and so forth, but there might end up being a shared story if you play it right.
Yeah, and I think that's really the core of it. I mean, you mentioned it in your presentation, you mentioned that connecting with people. At the end of the day, you know, yes, we might be moving towards the circular economy, but it all functions on people, and so those questions around values and you know, what's important are really a really great first step. So thank you, Matthew. We've got another question here from Alicia, who says, have you come across any clients impacted by COVID? So, for example, where baseline data is not really normal during
funny
COVID
about
operations.
That. I was just talking with one of my team this morning, because in Sydney you can't go out and do field work, and what do? We have a client in Sydney in the construction industry, and we're trying to finish off a consulting thing we did with them, but because of they're just scrambling just to manage the closure of the construction sites because of COVID, that what they're talking to us about, they just do not have the time to do it. So the impacts are big, and basically, as I talked to my colleague about this morning, we just have to work with our clients to sort of manage those expectations, and because I think people know the pressure that others are under because of COVID.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, as Alicia said, do you just go with transparency that the data might not be valid post COVID? And I think that's absolutely probably the best way around it.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got two more questions here. I hope we can get through them. So one from an anonymous attendee. Data is rapidly becoming the most valuable commodity in our economy if it isn't already. How do we ensure important circular economy data makes its way to the public realm?
Good question. I think, again, it depends on the context. So obviously at government levels and sort of local, state, federal, and national, national and international sort of things, there's a lot of responsibility for making data available, and there's sort of legal and political responsibilities to do so up to a point. So we have a right to expect good data coming from that direction that help focus the national, state, and regional approach. When it comes to individual operators, and particularly in the private sector, but even in the non-profit social enterprise sector, then I think the pushing out of data and stories is really driven by those organisations, and that's why I've been so strong about talking about the transparency, and if you're going to push something out, make sure you can back it up. If you can't, then a story about what you're hoping to do, and this is what we've achieved so far, is good to do, because people know that if you're just coming out of the blue and saying we've achieved this and we've achieved that, and people get suspicious because they say, what a year ago you were fighting against this and now you're the greenest company. No. People won't accept that. So, so I think it's the responsibility of anyone that's trying to connect out from where they are to other businesses, to networks, to governments, to the community, to consumers. The responsibility is yours to make sure that you put out the right information and don't get caught up in just the marketing story.
Yeah, I think that kind of lends into Rebecca's question around, whether you have any concerns that measuring the circular economy becomes a tick box exercise rather than organisations taking that deep look at their operations. So, I think
yes.
A
short answer from me. Yes, I am concerned about that. I've experienced it many, many times. Not necessarily on circular economy, because circular economy is still developing, but in other sustainability areas and energy, water, waste, carbon, building performance. That was sort of one of my areas of practice, that there's always that client that just expects you to kick the tires and give everything a tick. And it's easy to get sucked into that because there's a lot of pressure. They've engaged you, they want you to do this, but it's important, particularly for people like us, to, if the news is not good, to, be authentic and communicate the news is not good, but we can help you improve your story. So it's really, I think, incredible responsibility that if you're going to make claims, you've got to do it the right way.
Yeah. And I think it's just, so we've got a couple more questions, which I'm not sure that we're going to get to. We're at time now, but Sophie has just asked if we've got some case studies, and certainly we could get back to her on some of those when we send out the video next week. And Alison's also said, is it still worth adding to your website that you're starting your journey? I don't know. I would argue yes, as long as you've got something to support it, just based on what you were saying there, Matthew.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Nicole. Yeah.
Because you've got to start from somewhere, and as you say, if all of a sudden snap, you're promoting yourself as this.
We want people to start.
Got to show the journey.
We want people to do that, and if we make the bar of entry too high or too purist, but if if you're not sure what your carbon emissions are, then you can say, we are in the process of pulling that together. Great. That's honest, and that's the truth. And people can see these people, they've been living under a rock for the last 20 years. But now they've got it, and they're on their way. And hopefully, okay, if they haven't in a year's time measured their carbon emissions, then we'll know they're not fair income about it. So.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. There's a couple of questions which we can come back with some responses to those in the mail out with the video next week. So Matthew's kindly offered to help us with that. So I'll close it off there. We're a couple of minutes over time, but hopefully people, it's not interjecting to your day too much. But thank you, Matthew, so much for putting the effort into preparing your presentation today and for sharing your insights. It's such a privilege to be able to just have a little tap into your vast experience and that of the Edge Environment team. So thank you very, very much. And thanks to everyone who's joined as well today, taking time out of your busy Friday, to participate. We hope that today's been a real sort of, start for you in your metrics journey to provide some insights as you go along to transition to a circular economy. Just a reminder, and I think Lucy's mentioned this in the chat, that we will be doing some additional webinars on metrics, a little bit deeper dive in the coming months, so keep an eye out for that. And just generally to keep an eye out for any of the ACE Hub upcoming events, just subscribe to our newsletter on our website, so acehub.org.au, and you'll also find the recording of this particular webinar on there later next week, as well as other resources. So hopefully this has been a valuable spend of your time. Thank you again, Matthew, for all of your time and efforts, and happy weekend and stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.